Hmm. Hmm. I don't.
The corrector here.
Here.
And just a couple of things before we get started. Plenty of food in the back. Help yourself if you want ice cream. Just let me know. I'll get it out of the freezer. This is our first members only event for the spring. They're all on the fourth Thursday of the month. Next month, I will be talking on the 1913 flood. I know you've all heard the flood before, but they're all brand new first person accounts. And we're still finding, I just today
1820 to 1920.
First-hand account of what happened to Champion Paper when the fire broke out. So that's getting added in. So this is all going to be, you know, through the eyes of the people that went through the flood. And then in April, Mary Royer, who's here, is going to be talking on our quilt collection. We have a public quilt exhibit opening the second.
You almost said auction.
That will be opening the 2nd of May to the public, so the members only will get a sneak preview of the quilt exhibit on that evening, and Mary's going to talk on all of the quilts that we have here in the exhibit. And then our May one, I don't know the exact title, but Rich Pyland is going to be talking on things people did for fun in Hamilton in 1922. And it's going to be what movies were out, what the major stage plays were, what people were doing, you know, swimming and boating on the canal, things like this. So it should be really a good time. So that's our 4 programs that we have scheduled for this spring. And I thank you for all coming. And I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Sara Butler, who is our vice president here on the board of the Butler County Historical Society. She is our clothing expert. She loves playing with all of our clothes. And thanks to her, we found a lot of incredible things here in our collections. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sara. Sara, do you want questions during, or do you want to wait?
I have a couple points in the presentation where I'll stop the question.
Okay.
And I'm thinking that's easy with people online.
Yeah. For those of you that are online, I hope, are you hearing everything okay online? If not, go to your chat box and tell us that we're having problems hearing. And any questions you want to write or ask, you can write in the chat box and we'll pick them up as we go. So, okay?
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. This is the first I've done something in person in 2 years, so it's been a long time. Picked a nice night to do it, right? So we just want to make sure everybody online is okay. Does it look like it's working okay?
Seem to be, yeah.
I want to tell people online that we have clothing here for us to look at during this presentation, but I have taken pictures of all these and they're embedded in the slide. So as I talk about something, you should be able to see it online too. And one more thing about the people, for the people online, if you want to go to full screen, go up in the corner on the right-hand side and click view, and you can go to full screen. You ought to get a better image of the slides. Hopefully everybody's okay with the slides. Because technology gets complicated when you're doing in person and online. So tonight I am going to talk about the way people acquired clothing from around 1820 to around 1920 and how that changed over that period of time. I'm going to talk both about men's clothing and women's clothing. I have to wander back here to advance the slide each time. So I'll start by giving you some background. So we'll go way back to the 18th century. And this is the time, obviously, of the founding of our country and even the founding of Butler County. But at that point in time, class differences were very obvious by the way people looked. So if you're walking down the street in Cincinnati, you would know people's social class by the way they looked, and especially by the way they dressed. So at that point in time, almost all clothing was custom made. Either you made it yourself, a family member made it, or a tailor or dressmaker made it. Textiles were made in factories, but not clothing. This is prior to the sewing machine, so think about this. Every stitch of every clothing was done by hand, every item of clothing. So you sewed each thing by hand. That meant clothing was very expensive and that fashion was the province of only the rich. Clothing was, yeah, very different by social class. For working class people, clothing was functional. You wore what you had to, what you could find to cover your body. And the idea of fashion, the changing styles, wasn't a part of working class life. So also by way of background, I want to say a little bit about gender during the 19th century. So during this time period, men and women were thought to have very different places in society and play very different roles. So a man's place was in the public realm, a woman's place was in the home. So women were expected to be virtuous, delicate, submissive, genteel, incapable of doing anything in the public world. So it was expected that a woman would marry and her primary role would be to take care of the home. I want to read a quote from Ladies' Home Journal. This is from Edward Bach, who was an editor, and he said, "There are no two greater factors in human life today than woman and home. Separate the two, and they become like two divided parts of a pair of scissors." In other words, one last bit of background. The sewing machine. This is a trade card to sell sewing machines that was distributed in Hamilton. So on the left side, that's the front of the trade card. On the back, selling a sewing machine. I want to point out the sewing machine because it was so critical in changing the way people got their clothes. It was probably the most important development in the history of clothing and the production of clothing because it sped the production of clothing. And it gave people of all social classes the opportunity to participate in fashion. So I'm going to start by talking about men's clothing. And then I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about women's clothing after this. And when I use the term ready to wear, you're all familiar with the term ready to wear. It means you purchase it and wear it right away. Our clothing today is almost all ready to wear. So in the early 19th century, only very small amounts of men's clothing was ready to wear. It was made mainly for sailors. It was very poorly made, and it was called slops. And it was a sign of working class or lower class. So for a good share of the 19th century, most men had their clothing made by a tailor. So let's use the example of John Benninghoff. Say he wants a suit in the 1870s. He would go up to a tailor shop on High Street. There are a number of those. He would have his measurements taken, and he would have a suit custom made to his measurements. In the 19th century, fit was an important indicator of social class. So he would want his suit to fit precisely. He liked to show his status. We know from the house he liked to show his status. So he would want a very well-fitted suit. So. Oh, okay.
Geez, and every time I try to type.
Is that better? Somebody online, is that better?
Well, unfortunately, every time I type, it advances the slides.
Oh, oh dear.
Yeah, it's right in her face. And this woman's like, put the mic closer.
Yeah, we did put the mic closer.
Should we try it for a few slides and see if that helps? You all can hear me in the room, right? Okay. Let me see if I can turn volume up. Okay. Wow. No, not on there. Right? Oh, I'm here. Oh, okay. Intermission. One place. Something. Oh, that's louder. Oh my goodness. Is that too loud for you?
That's good.
Okay. Oh. That's loud for me. All right. Well, we'll hope that works. Okay, so tailor-made suits. John Benninghoff, who likes to display his status, he would have had a custom-made suit. They were expensive, obviously, even though the sewing machine helped, there was a lot of handwork involved in these custom-made suits. So middle-class men would not have had very many suits. And working-class men would actually save for years to be able to buy a suit, and they would wear that suit for years. So people didn't have closets full of clothing like we do today. So let's take a look at some local tailors John Benninghoffen might have patronized. On the left, you see a trade card for John Moss, who was a tailor in Hamilton. This card is probably, didn't have a date on it, it's probably 1870s to 1880s. Moss was born in Bavaria about 1830 and immigrated here, and he lived with his extended family on Dayton Street in Hamilton. And in the 1880 census, he's listed as a merchant tailor. Up here in the top corner on the right, you can see this is the label from the inside of the coat we have. And it was a coat that was custom made by the, I believe it's pronounced Scheuble brothers. And it was made for Mr. Adolph Haig in 1895. And down here is a section of the city directory, and you can see a listing of the tailors in 1898-99. And you can see the Scheuble brothers here, down here. And you might take a look at Levy the tailor here. I'm going to say a little bit about him later. Louis Scheuble immigrated from Germany in 1867, and then his brother, who was in the business with him, was actually born in Ohio. Some tailors advertised in the newspaper. This is an ad by Fred Merger, who was a merchant tailor, and you can see he makes a point of saying that he does just custom work. He does say down at the bottom that he also has a line of underwear, shirts, collars. Those were probably ready to wear, but his suits would have been custom made. Now here's a different way men could have gotten suits. This is a flyer promoting suits sold by C.A. Luke in 7 Mile. In this case, Luke would have taken a man's measurements, sent them to, you see up at the top, the Howard Tailoring Company in Chicago. The suit would have been made in Chicago to those measurements and then sent back here. So it's a custom-made suit, but C.A. Luke didn't make the suit. It's another way of getting a custom-made suit. And then the fabric swatches would have been attached to this flyer, and men could pick out their own fabrics. So I want to say just a word about men's clothing styles so we can kind of make sense of this move to ready to wear. On the right-hand side, you see what's called a frock coat. And frock coats were longer, they had a waistline seam, and they were more fitted. And what you see over on the form there is a frock coat. On the left-hand side is what was called a sack coat. And it had no waistline seam, it's boxier, not as fitted, and it's called a sack jacket. And that's what's hanging there on the, I didn't put a picture of this in the slide, so but for those of you here, that's hanging there on the rack, the easel. So since sack suits didn't have to be so precisely fit, they were easier to mass produce. So the popularity of these sack jackets went along at the same time as we saw mass production. So this is a picture for the people online to see our frock suit. When it was cut away to the back, like you see there, it was called a morning coat. And I think one of the reasons for that cutaway is so that the watch chain would be more visible. And men didn't have much in the way of decoration or jewelry, so it would be a way to show off your expensive watch chain and a watch fob. There's a watch fob hanging from it. By the way, men's suits are very difficult to date because they don't change very much over time. Women's clothing, you can pretty much determine date within a few years. Men's clothing, not so much. So
I'm still complaining, and I can't advance slides and type at the same time. So
you want me to stop?
I'm just gonna
Having trouble.
when she still said I can.
Oh,
I'm going to turn it up a little bit more. And I've turned the microphone more towards you now.
Okay.
Because you
How's
can just,
that? Yeah, we get, you turn it up so much so you feedback. Yeah. Okay, we're gonna try it again. Okay,
His wife said,
wow. Technology. We talk about the advances like the sewing machine, but. So, this is the cover of an 1893 manufacturer's ready-to-wear catalog. So this, actually, this morning suit on the cover looks a lot like our suit, doesn't it? So this is a catalog that a manufacturer's representative would have brought to, for example, a store uptown in Hamilton to talk to the menswear buyer to sell suits to them. So these are ready-made suits in standard size. So the suits would have been made in a factory and then shipped to the store in Hamilton. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this whole process of making ready-to-wear when I talk about women's clothing. This is the inside of that catalog. You can see a frock suit here. They call it a Prince Albert's because it's closed in the front, but you can see that waistline seam that makes it a little more tricky to make. And then here are the wholesale prices. So you can't see them in the back. This $13, $18, $18, $20. So that would have been the price to the department store. They make a point down here that quality is just as good, and I'm going to read you a little bit of this. No, I'm not. But they make the point that the quality is just as good as tailor-made, because the job of the manufacturer of ready-to-wear is to dispel that idea that ready-to-wear is slops, that it's poor quality. This is another page in the catalog, and notice this time they're selling sack suits. And the price is here, $7, $8.50. Lower prices for that sack suit because it's easier to make. By the way, if you were wondering, there's a $6 suit up here. I did one of the price comparison things. $6 then would be about $180 today, which sounds high to me for a man's suit, because I think it's so high because we have to take into consideration the efficiencies of production that we've seen over the years by today's manufacturing standards. This is an ad from 1894, the Hamilton Evening Journal, and it is for the bargain clothing store. And as you can see, they're selling men's suits based on price, essentially. So as ready-to-wear grew in men's clothing, the competition, as you can imagine, between tailors and the ready-to-wear stores grew more intense. So at the end of the 1800s, tailors were still serving Hamilton, but ready-to-wear was growing in popularity. Some tailors hung on though. This is a tailor shop. You can see after the turn of the 20th century, this is Engel and Levy Tailors. They had a shop in the First National Bank building in the 1890s, and Albert Levy stayed in business till at least 1935. So he must have been fairly successful. In the upper left corner there, you see a picture of Albert Levy. It's taken around somewhere between 1900 and 1906. And I know the quality of these pictures aren't good, but these are old pictures. So, and this is one of his employees, Herman Knighters. And I couldn't resist putting this in. Mary found this when we were doing our suffrage research. This was an ad in the paper that said, "Votes for women, tailors for men." I just love that. I had to put that in. It told us a little bit about the Levy politics, I guess. So the fact that Levy stayed in business for so long tells us that some men still prefer tailor-made suits. This, I think, is a very interesting comparison. This is same newspaper, same advertiser, George Krebs, 4 years apart. On the left, George Krebs is advertising tailor-made suits, and he makes a point of the quality of tailor-made suits. 4 years later, he's advertising ready-to-wear suits, and they are in new and snappy lines. So the emphasis here is there is quality. The emphasis here is fashion. Higher price here, notice the price is $20, $25 in here, $10, $12, $50, and so on. I just, I think putting those two ads together is just the move to ready to wear is pretty obvious. So by 1920s, almost all men's clothing was purchased ready-made. Men in all parts of the country were able to purchase suits ready-made, either from a local store or from a catalog. This is a Sears catalog from the 1920s. So although tailors were still in business, their customer base was shrinking. So I'm going to stop here to see if you have any questions at this point. I'm doing a specific break. Yeah, yes. Mary?
Where people also come in and have their suits tailored, altered, adjusted, whatever, in addition to the ready-made idea.
Most likely they did. Yeah, had their suits altered. That was very common in women's clothing ready to wear. I expected that same thing probably happened with tailors too. Although I would imagine tailors were a little bit put out by having to alter ready to wear. I mean, they probably would be thinking, you should have come to me to begin with, and it would have fit you right. Yeah, exactly. I think you're right.
I had a question. Like I noticed in the Prince Albert coat how it came down like that. Did they sit in those jackets, or did when they go into a place they stood mostly, and then when they went into a place take them off? Because he would be sitting on the tail of his coat there, which
He probably did sit on the tail of his coat. Yeah, because this might be a banker or somebody like that, and that would be what he'd work in. People dress so formally, yeah. People are just more uncomfortable in their clothes than we are. They just were. Wait till we get to women. Yeah, it's just, and men's, other than this whole suit you had on, you had a stiff collar on too. This one doesn't look too bad, but with high starch collars are very uncomfortable for men.
The collars were detachable, of course.
The collars were detachable until 1920s.
So they'd wear the same shirt all week and just change the collar.
Yeah, and sometimes change the cuffs too. Sometimes the cuffs were detachable. Yeah.
You have an online question. It was like, oh.
No. It's their.
Okay, any more questions before we move on to women's clothing? So let's do women's clothing and take a look at how that was made over the same time period. So the move to ready to wear was very different for women. Remember, women's roles were different. Dress was a very important part of the domestic sphere. So I'm going to read a quote here from Harper's Bazaar that tells us about that. So, be in heart and life simple, honest, pure, and kind. For a woman's clothes are an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. Is that true for all of you? Are your clothes an outward visible sign of your inward grace? So this is a fashion plate from Godey's Ladies magazine in 1869. And Godey's, if you haven't heard of it, was a widely read magazine by women of all social classes in all parts of the country. And it instructed women on how to do everything, how to behave, how to keep house, how to take care of the children, and especially how to dress. These dresses are obviously not ready to wear. So unlike the steady growth in ready to wear for men, ready to wear grew much more slowly for women. Women were able to buy some basic things ready to wear in the 19th century, things like cloaks and underwear, but not dresses. Not dresses until the 1910-ish time period. And like for men, fit was a very important part of status for women. So I can't take credit for this beautiful slide. It was done by some students of mine. But I'm showing it to you for a couple of reasons. First of all, dress in the lower corner here is this dress right here. And it was worn by Emma Dersch, who was a school teacher in Hamilton. The rest of the dresses I'm showing you because I wanted you to see this over 2-decade timeline. If you look closely, the styles change, but the complexity of the clothing does not change. That continues for women throughout the 19th century up through, again, the 1910 era. And remember, fit is critical. So this dress, this tiny little waist. How would Emma Dersch have gotten this dress? This is 1890s. These big sleeves are the clues that it's 1890s. So sewing was a basic skill for almost all women. She could have made this herself. By 1890, sewing machines were available. That must have made it easier. Actually, think of sewing machines when they were first invented for women. Women who spent hours and hours and hours doing hand stitching of all their clothing. And then the sewing machine comes. And it's like, wow, it must have been a miracle device for women. Okay, it must have been just incredible. Maybe kind of like cell phones are for us. I don't know. Another thing that made making your own clothing easier was sized paper patterns. So earlier in the 19th century, the ladies' magazines would print very basic patterns and women would have to size them up or down, and that was very difficult to do. So by 1880s, Butterick made sized paper patterns so you could buy something that would help you make something closer to your own size. So gave women an important advantage in negotiating that problem of fit. But look at these dresses. So you have a sized paper pattern. Look at how complicated they are. You would have to be very skilled to make that yourself. That means most women, middle class and upper class, relied on dressmakers. Dressmakers would do all that complex construction and help with that all-important element of fit. I'm going to take a few minutes now and talk about this whole process of dressmakers and dressmaking. Dressmaking was a respectable occupation for a woman. The majority of women preferred not to work, but if they worked, dressmaking was a acceptable occupation. It was kind of a natural occupation because it was needlework. The most well-known dressmakers created their own designs and traveled to Europe. Even local dressmakers traveled to New York to see the latest fashions and see the latest fabrics. So women had several options for employment in the dressmaking area. They could start as a seamstress, perhaps as these women are, and work their way up to dressmaking. So seamstresses did the basic stitching, the seams, the basting, sometimes the pressing and so on. Another option for women was dressmaking school. So a lot of the big cities had dressmaking schools. Cincinnati had several. She could then work on as a dressmaker on her own, or she could work in a big department store in a dressmaking department. So larger stores in Cincinnati had dressmaking departments, so a woman could go to a big department store, have a dress custom made. Dressmakers also worked in people's houses. So they would go to a house, stay there for 2 weeks or so, and do all the dressmaking, the alterations for the family over that time period. They get a room in the house and they get their meals. Some women worked their way up so that they had dressmaking facilities in their own home, and some even had their own salons. If you reach the top of the pinnacle of dressmaking, you could have your own salon. So think about the relationship between the dressmaker and her client. There was a clear social class difference between the dressmaker and her client. They're very complicated relationships. The clients viewed their dressmaker as kind of social inferiors, yet they were dependent on those women too, to tell them about the latest fashion and make the best dresses. And the dressmakers thought of themselves as independent business women. Woman didn't want to lose her good dressmaker once she had located one. So it's treading this fine line between being superior and not offending your dressmaker. And what about the dressmakers? They knew a lot about their clients. They knew their measurements. They knew a lot. They had to be careful not to gossip. They probably had to resist the temptation to gossip. So discretion was necessary on the part of the dressmaker. I know that's not a very clear image, but I just thought it did such a good job of this line between the dressmaker and the client. So this painting is titled Dressmaker at the Window. Dressmakers were often at the mercy of their clients. So sometimes the dress would be made and the woman wouldn't pay, or they were slow in paying. And sometimes the husbands got the bill and they didn't want to pay. Sometimes wealthy clients could be very demanding. So sometimes clients weren't satisfied with the way the dress made them look. Maybe it didn't make them have the body they had imagined. So it could be difficult. I put this slide in because I thought maybe she looked like she was ready to jump out the window. So this is an 1890s dress that's in our collection, and it was exhibited at the Miami Art Museum. And it is clearly a dressmaker dress. I have it laid out right here. We don't know who wore it. We don't know who the dressmaker was. But as you can see, the numbers, Cincinnati was a center for dressmaking. 1,500 dressmakers in the city directory in 1897, and 93 here in Hamilton in 1892. So let me describe the process of how somebody would go about having the dress made. So the woman who wore this dress probably, I'm going to show you the inside in just a second. She probably had her own dressmaker. So she, well, let's assume she was in Hamilton. She would go to her dressmaker's house, and with the proper undergarments on, the dressmaker would, most of them draped right on the woman's body. So they take the fabric and drape it, cut it out right on the body. And then the dressmaker would baste it together. The client would come back for first fitting, and then dressmaker would make alterations. Then the woman would come back for a final fitting. So she would also pick out the fabrics and the trims with the help of the dressmaker. So that could all happen in a dressmaker's home or in a salon if she had a salon. So this is the interior of this bodice. So as you can see, most of these bodices had a lot of boning. So remember, these bone bodices were worn on top of a bone corset. These bones were, by this time, they're steel, which is actually better. They were whalebone prior to that. Steel is a little more flexible. But when you look at the inside of this, you can see how complicated that is to make. I mean, it's just difficult. You had to have some advanced skills to make something like this. And the bottom of the skirt with all these pleats. And when you think about this, you realize how expensive it is. So each dress would have been priced individually based on the complexity, on the quality of the fabrics, and so on. So the fact that it's priced individually is an important thing to think about. So this dress is over there, the purple dress. And in this case, we know who the dressmaker is. Her name was Anna Dunleavy, and she came to this country at the age of 14. She married a laborer. They had 6 children. And she worked for a fancy goods retailer, probably to supplement her husband's income. And that proved to be a good experience for her. And she started dressmaking. So in 1894, her husband drowned in the Ohio River. And she had to support her children by herself, but by then she had some advanced dressmaking skills, and her business was growing, and she was successful enough to move her business from her home to a salon at the corner of 4th and Rafe Street in Cincinnati, which is a nice location. So this dress is from about 1906. So you can see how closely Anna Dunleavy conformed to the fashions of the time period. I know this is a little hard to see. It's from a newspaper. Harper's Bazaar would have been a high fashion newspaper. But if you look at the dress here and look at this fashion illustration, high neckline, this fullness in the bodice, a short jacket idea, the same waistline, the same stitching on the skirt. This is a high fashion dress made by a Cincinnati dressmaker. This is the interior of that bodice. And you can see the boning again, the hand stitching. You know what this is? This white here? Any guesses? No, it's a dress shield. So this is pre-deodorant. So in order to protect those valuable textiles from perspiration, dress shields were added. And you can see that famous Dunleavy label. These are Anna Dunleavy seamstresses in 1895. They did that primary work of straight stitching the seams, hand sewing, pressing, and so on. So this would have been good experience for them, apprentice time. They would have been able to work their way up to dressmaking status. Anna was so famous that one of her clients came from Beaumont, Texas, at this time, once a year to get her dresses from Anna Dunleavy. This dress was worn by Blanche Murphy, and it was made by a Hamilton dressmaker. Ida Gorsuch lived here in Butler County her whole life. Early in her marriage, she and her husband farmed, and they were painters and wallpapers. And when she was in her 40s, Ida decided to get into dressmaking, probably because it was more lucrative, and began to make these dresses. And she made incredibly detailed dresses with tucks and pleats and lace inserts. Ida was interviewed on her 100th birthday in the 1960s, and she talked about how she made her own patterns and made these frilly dresses. This is a close-up of a waistline of a bodice that was made in Oxford. So the Emmerich family lived on Beach and Walnut, and the household consisted of Martha and her 2 daughters, Lily and Alberta, and they listed their occupations as dressmakers in the 1900 census. So I think they probably worked out of their home. Most dressmakers did not add their names to their dresses. We have probably hundreds of dressmaker dresses here, and very few of them have the dressmaker label. Local women just didn't do it, which is really unfortunate. This is an ad from the Chicago Tribune that I just couldn't resist including. Notice it says the dressmaker's message to the stout woman: get an emo corset before having your new gowns fitted. And down further it says, why does your dressmaker recommend this corset? Because it saves her work. So I would expect that the dressmaker would prefer that the corset did the job of creating this body the woman wanted, rather than her trying to do it through the dress. By the way, this is an ad for the stout woman. How stout is that woman? Really? All right, quick break for questions.
Okay.
Do you have any more luck online? Any questions? Yes.
Actually, I had 2. I was wondering, the dress that belonged to the school teacher, would she have worn that for?
Oh, that's a good question. 1890s. I'm thinking maybe not. By 1890s, we're going to talk about these shirtwaists, and there were other types of dress that might have been more realistic for teachers.
My other question was, how did these survive?
How did these survive? You know, That's an interesting question, because when I look at a dress like this, it's in such perfect condition. I think she probably didn't wear it very much. And then that makes me wonder, why didn't she wear it very much? I don't know. I just worry that sometimes people might have died or something before they wore these. Now, one thing that may be the case here is these big giant sleeves like this went out of fashion relatively quickly. Now, oftentimes women would remake them. They'd redo the giant sleeves and make a new bodice and wear the same skirt. But this one persisted with these huge sleeves. For some reason, it just didn't get worn very much. It's in great condition. That one is in more delicate condition. I think that was worn. We have a lot of things that have clearly been worn a lot. Yes.
Do the dressmakers have fabric to choose from, or did people usually bring their fabric?
No, the dressmakers usually stock the fabric. They would determine what the latest fabrics in fashion were, and they would have a stock of fabric. Yeah. Yes.
What about the corsets? Who provided the corsets? They were already being made in a factory, were they?
Yeah, the corsets, they could be custom made too. Yes. If you went to an expensive corseteer who made expensive corsets, it could be custom made to your body. On the other hand, you could get corsets from the Sears catalog too.
When did this catalog start?
Oh, I want to say 1870s, 80s, 1880s-ish. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. They would be hard to make yourself a corset. Yes.
I made a corset and a dress for a lady that was never to be worn. It had buttons, full ball buttons from the back of her neck down to the bottom of her hem. Well, and just a minute, and I said, this is going to be very uncomfortable for you to sit in. I mean, it had a corset and all these buttons down the back. How are you going to sit in this? And she said, oh, my dear, it shan't be a problem. I'm going to be buried in it. I'm not wearing it.
What I was going to say is you could make these dresses. I mean, some people have enough skill to do it. Not all of us do. Okay, let's talk about the move to ready to wear. So change was on the horizon for the dressmaker. So here are 3 young women in Oxford. They could very well be examples of the new woman that's coming. So society was changing. Women were beginning to rebel against the separate sphere idea that restricted their lives. So that includes what they wore. So new thoughts about how women should behave were taking root, and more women were going to school, working, demanding the vote. That's not mine. So new clothing styles that allowed for more freedom and were adaptable to ready to wear. Other changes happening. The automobile was an important one. Women quickly realized it's really difficult to ride in an automobile with a big giant hat and a corset. So these cumbersome dresses just weren't practical. Cars increased mobility. They made the world smaller. They allowed people to get to stores to purchase ready to wear. Other new technologies are coming, movies, telephones. You know, the world is just more modern and the pace is much faster. And America is becoming a consuming society rather than a producing society. And that's true for clothing. So let's take a closer look at the development of ready-to-wear and the demise of dressmaking. So ready-to-wear, I said, there were some things that were available in the 19th century, not a lot. But look at this information here. 1897, less than half of clothing in the US was ready-to-wear. 1907, virtually all clothing is available ready-to-wear. It happens very quickly. Is this ad for Holbrook's? Yeah, Holbrook. You can see all the ready-to-wear available in 1907. Skirts, shirtwaists, suits. Quite a bit. So the first of the new ready-to-wear garments is a shirtwaist, and this is a shirtwaist here. ad here is for National Cloak and Suit Company. They provided ready-to-wear shirtwaists through a catalog. Shirtwaists were very popular. We have 1 million of them in our collection. Well, not 1 million, but a lot. When they first came out, they were not very well fitted, poorly made. And I want to read a quote from 1906 issue of Cosmopolitan. "Let no one speak disrespectfully of ready-to-wear apparel this season. The situation as it stands today shows superior materials and high-grade workmanship, whereas a year ago, conditions were vastly different. The styles introduced in moderate price garments are equal to costumes turned out by fashionable dressmakers." Uh-oh, for the dressmakers. This is an ad from the Journal News for shirtwaists, or they call them waists here. They were available in a huge range of styles, huge range of prices. You can see 75 cents for a shirtwaist, all the way up to $5 for a shirtwaist. So they fit perfectly with the new active style of the new women. And women, this is also the beginning of this idea of mix and match, so you could wear different tops with different bottoms. The first ready-to-wear dress is the lingerie dress that you see over here. And they also were sold in a whole range of styles and a whole range of prices. The lingerie dress is kind of like a shirtwaist with a skirt attached. This looks, to our 21st century eye, this looks very complicated, but it's much less complicated than this or that. No boning. It could be made ready to wear relatively easily. Much more comfortable to wear. Lower cost, so women of all social classes could be fashionable. By the way, this particular dress was a Hamilton High School graduation dress from 1903, and the little pin on it is actually the graduation pin. Yeah. So most of these ready-to-wear dresses were made in garment factories in New York City. The women working in these factories were long hours under poor conditions, little pay. When you think about this, women were still the producers of clothing, like the dressmaker, but the job was very different. If you were working in a garment factory, you did the same task over and over. So let's say you're the person who put the sleeve in, you do that task over and over and over all day, and sometimes quotas were set. It just was an unpleasant job. The higher paid jobs, the management jobs, were primarily men. So the great wave of immigrants at the beginning of the 20th century provided both a market and a labor force for the growing ready-to-wear industry. So you could establish a garment factory by buying some machines, finding a space, hiring a bunch of unskilled immigrants at low pay, and you're in business. For immigrant women, it was sometimes the only job they could find. And by the way, the interior, this picture is taken as the interior of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. You may have heard of that horrible fire in 1911. Another option for making ready-to-wear was called the putting out system. And that's where these runners, this little kid here who's carrying garment pieces, would take them to an apartment. People would sew them together in the apartment, and then they'd be picked up and taken back to the factory. So the new ready-to-wear dresses were bought in some of the big department stores. So this is Mabley and Carew in Cincinnati. Some of you may be familiar with Mabley and Carew. So what's the advantage of ready-to-wear for women? Well, you get to purchase it immediately, take it home with you. It's at a lower price. Stores offered free alterations, so you could get a little bit of a custom fit. No more haggling with the dressmaker over the price. The personal relationship is gone between the dressmaker and the client, and maybe that's good, maybe it's not so good, but for some people, it's much better, much more impersonal. You could also get ready to wear from a mail order catalog. So with the expansion of catalogs like Sears and National Cloak, women even in remote areas out on the farm could get ready to wear at reasonable prices. You can see lingerie dresses from National Cloak and Suit and shirtwaists from actually Pictorial Magazine. So I want to summarize by using examples of two Butler County couples. So this is animation and Charles Sohngen in 1880. The date is important. So how could Charles get his wedding suit? Well, he could have bought it ready to wear, or he could have had it made by a tailor uptown here in Hamilton. How does Anna get her wedding dress in 1880? Well, she could make it herself, or she could use a dressmaker. Those are essentially her only options. It's a very complicated dress. Remember, it would have been expensive. So she would have worn her wedding dress over and over. It was expected that you would wear your wedding dress over and over. By the way, it's common practice to wear a colored dress and a white veil. Looks a little odd to us, but it was very common. So here's another Butler County couple. This is 27 years later. The couple on the left are the bride and groom. Abby was a school teacher and John Shaw was a farmer. How did he get his suit? Well, the same way we just talked about with Charles Sohngen. He could have a tailor make it or could buy it ready to wear. How could Abby get her dress now though? Well, she could make it herself. She could have a dressmaker make it, but she could also get it from a catalog, or she could get it from a department store. There weren't many in Hamilton yet, but she could go down to Cincinnati and get her dress ready made. So here's a good example of a local middle-class couple who could be in the latest fashion by 1907. So remember at the beginning, I talked about the clear difference in social class by looking at what people wore. By this time, you can't tell so easily. And when you think about us today, can you tell social class of the people in this room by what they're wearing? No, it's because we're all wearing ready-to-wear clothing. So what happened to the tailors and the dressmakers? The downside is the downfall of these graphs. So I did a count of the dressmakers and tailors and the city directories, and you can see the decline of dressmakers and tailors over time. So final slide. I chose this slide because I thought this guy was almost looking like he could see what was coming. So today, most of our clothing is made in other parts of the world, sold in big chains or department stores, or often online these days. Sweatshops continue. Some are here, most are in other countries. So our mass-produced clothing is pretty inexpensive, and we have a lot of it. We can't determine social class through clothing anymore. But, you know, I think there's a sameness to our clothing that we didn't see then. People had custom-made, unique clothing. And that art of dressmaking and tailoring has been lost. So that's what I have tonight. If you have any more questions or comments?
I think one of the other things we've lost is the fit.
Yes.
Because we get so much comfort, ready to wear, like while you look at my pants are a little too long. My situation, just roll them up cuff. But you know, back then you would have had it made exactly to fit. And even when I was in school in the late 60s and early 70s, I took home ec, and we learned how to take patterns and adjust them to your fit. You would make a skirt, but you had to take your measurements and cut them down. You learned how to make buttonholes and that kind of stuff. But you made a garment that actually fit your body and your shape.
Mm-hmm.
And now you don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
You just get some kind of a sack in any old shape. And if it doesn't fit perfectly, who cares?
Yeah.
I mean, we've gotten so we're more accepting of not being neat and tailored looking.
Well, and fit is no longer a sign of status. No one cares so much for fit. Comfort is more a factor than fit. Yeah. There's the two sides to the fit thing. There's the comfort plus the comfort.
It's not the flexibility of clothing.
Yeah.
It's
Oh,
the
yeah.
fact that if a seam comes undone, people don't even have sewing machines or the needle and thread or have the patience, and they just throw it away. And it's
Yeah.
all because the seam needs a 2-inch stitch or. Get rid of just
Yeah.
because.
A lot of your clothing isn't even backstitched now. A seam
Oh,
is not backstitched and your buttons are not knotted. They just, there are a few loops to.
Yeah, my students had no concept of alterations.
Do you have any idea?
Repair.
Mike, do you have any idea like how many households now even have one of those machines?
No, I don't.
I have 4. Well, yes, but you're weird.
It's true.
I have 2 right now.
4? Yeah.
2 strikes,
Yeah.
it's too long.
Yeah.
Do you know, I've got a little fact that nobody knows. Do you know why sewing machines in a home, the needles in a home sewing machine are different than the needles in an industrial machine? Don't do you?
I do, but I don't remember what I know.
They decided that women were too stupid to figure out with your needle, you have a little notch as you catch down through the shuttle. Well, they figured women were too stupid to figure out on just a round needle that fit in to see that little notch and put it in the right position. So they made the sewing machine needles to the front of the machine, so you could only put the needle in one way.
I recently altered a dress for my daughter-in-law who was to sing at a function, and it was 29 feet around the hem.
Yeah.
I called on my friend out here for a bit of advice because I had to take it up and 29 feet.
29 feet.
Yeah, it must have been a big.
Yes, it was.
Good grief.
But it had been ready-made, of course, but it had a roll piece, and to, because I was taking it up, I had to please it, and that's when I just had an accident. I was in bed and I had this great dress all over the bed, taking it up. But
We have some beautiful dresses for Mary and I often mourn over these dresses. So someday we have to do an exhibit on treasures of the collection or something, so we can get out some of these fabulous. I just got these out because of this dressmaker topic. We have a lot of others that are just mind blowing.
I have 2 friends in Australia. One who has clothing right back, well, this was in the 1980s. She had clothing back to her great grandmother, and every now and again she'd have a fashion parade to raise money, and she had all these clothes, but of course they only had a few garments, of course, then, but she still had. And then I have another friend, and she has kept just about every garment she's owned since she was a kid. Her husband, when they built a new house, he had to build a room, especially, and of course when she was young she was like that. Now she's like this, but she's kept all those garments. And again, we used to use that for fundraising, use her clothes for fundraising, but we'd have to get all these slim girls.
I hope she donates them to the museum.
Well, I'm sure she will, but it's interesting. But the other thing was when I was doing social, what was it called, social studies, home economics, I made a petticoat. We used to wear petticoats in those days. Made this petticoat, was all fitted on the bosom, and I embroidered all. But by the end of the year, it didn't fit me. All the work I'd gone to. Fortunately, I was able to give it to another girl, but I put so much work into it, and it didn't fit at the end of the year.
I think one thing that was interesting I saw in your pictures was the sewing machines. Those treadle sewing machines, both of my grandmothers had them in their houses in Hamilton. And I don't know if any of you have ever used a treadle, but you've got to get it spinning in the right way and then get your feet going in a rhythm. They are not easy to sew on.
They are useful. We had a power outage, and I had something to finish in my family room, and I went up, fired that booger up.
I know if you know, and that is the one thing, those mechanical things, but being the women had, it is definitely a skill to get that rolling in the right place and stop it, back stitch it, and just keep that treadle running. Yeah, but both of my grandmothers had them.
And
I
That
think
might have
once-
been hard,
and in
but
the
it's a whole
house,
lot
it's
easier.
nice. Once you get used to it, you're not even thinking about
Yeah.
it.
No,
I have
it's-
been a dressmaker friend who way into the 50s, never got rid of her treadle. Did not get an electric. She always had a treadle. It was her wonderful machine because you had a relationship with it. You weren't even thinking twice about your movements.
Mhm,
and
it was just all automatic.
And by the way, the early machines were hand cranked.
Yes,
You
I had one of
you
those
had
too.
one hand over here and the
They
other
still
one
Okay.
trying
use
to
those
guide
in
you.
England. They
You guys are
still use those machines in England.
The hand
My cousin has two of them, hand crankers.
And
The early
kids,
treadles
they made them
have
for
the
kids.
hand crank
Little-
on them.
I have my little singer,
Yeah, that's what I
my
have
daughter
too.
was
One of the
about
little-
6. I still
Oh, I
have
have one of those.
The little metal ones in the case.
Yes.
One of those. Yeah, the little
Get
get you used to that in sewing.
I have my grandmother's featherweight.
The other thing,
Wow.
I think the other thing that's important with all this beautiful needlework they didn't have electricity,
No, no.
No.
Until late.
and they didn't, and a lot of those women didn't have glasses, and you think they were probably, may have had cataracts. So it always amazes me is with the quilts that were made in way back in those times, that they did the quilts all by hand, and they didn't have all these
I know.
um,
Well, stay tuned for our next exhibit on quilts.
And speaking of that, there's a lot of people who are doing quilt history and trying to remove quilts from this homely little thing for your bed. And they're saying, those beautifully made quilts, and I think it occurred to me this evening, these custom dresses with all these touches like that one with a little row of seed pearls around the top
Yes.
of the collar. People are saying this is equivalent to that beautiful handmade chair that we admire, or the
Mhm.
painting on the
Mhm.
wall. There is no difference between this gorgeous quilt, that beautiful dress, and that painting.
Yeah.
It's
They're works
Except,
of art.
except these are women's items, and that's the difference. That's why they have not been accorded that kind of status
Yes.
as the painting, the chair, the piece of furniture, the hand forged thing, the beautiful pottery. We have men's names attached, and I'm not getting into that kind of thing, but we attach the names to that, but these are all lost.
Yeah.
And I think now people are saying, wait, we must appreciate these things as we do that painting on
Yeah.
the wall.
I made 300 dresses for the May Festival Chorus, and every one of them has my label in the back.
You did. Yeah, you should.
I
You
did.
should, yeah, you
I
should
did.
sign it.
Every one
You
of them
should
has
sign
my
it like
label in
an
the back.
artist signs a book.
But these were never, like you said, signed, and most.
Most of them are not. No. Okay, well, I'm sorry.
There are still some very high-end tailors and stuff, like Armani suits or the designers and stuff. I think that's where the real custom work is.
Yes, yes, I think you're right.
Very pricey.
There still are, that would be an interesting thing to explore. Are there more men's tailors today than women's dressmakers? I don't know.
Oh, the
Yeah,
high
red
end.
carpet.
The high end, yeah, yeah.
Or, you
Well,
know,
there's
the-
couture,
yeah,
the whole
yeah, the
couture
whole
thing, I
couture
didn't
thing,
do.
yes, right.
Designer, custom.
And many of those, the houses of couture that they do both men and women's
Yes,
clothing,
Right,
so.
yeah. But yes, it still exists, you're right. It's
These
just-
dresses that are made specific, they would be called this bespoke clothing.
Yeah.
Mm,
It's
So
custom.
there's your difference, it's the bespoke.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming. That was fun. Thank you.
And I'm gonna make one more final comment. She kept pointing out to this picture over here, the beautiful lady in the, we just got this back from Weebles. Those of you that were here when we did the George W. White talk, this is the lady that had the hole in her shoulder. And Weebles not only put her shoulder back in, they restored the whole frame, but these 3 pictures have just come back from Weebles in the last month, so they're gorgeous, yeah.
So did we ever get to